Welcome to the Therapy and Prayer Podcast. Here you'll find the intersection between faith and mental health. I'm your host, Camille. I'm a licensed therapist and clinical social worker, but more importantly, I'm a Christian who really loves the Lord. And I'm just trying to navigate this life without falling victim to it, just like everyone else. Here we take a faith-based approach to all things mental health and wellness, because the Bible tells us to guard our heart and mind, and sometimes we need a little bit of help with that. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Therapy and Prayer Podcast. My name is Camille. So happy that you're here, as always. I hope that you're doing well. I hope that you are taking care of yourself and getting what you need and advocating for what you need. Sometimes the things we need are not right there, so we got to put in a little bit of effort. So I hope that you are putting in the effort and that you know that you are worth putting in that effort. Today, I want to talk about the uniqueness that we all experience on our healing and growth journeys. There are kind of two journeys that most of us go on, one of them having to do with our own personal healing and growth on a mental and emotional level. And then there's also this journey with God in our spiritual maturity and our growth there. And I think that there are some similarities there, but what I really want to talk about is the fact that each of those things are so individualized. And I think that it's really worth taking time to talk about how we all have to walk through these things differently in our own time and in our own ways, and that is okay. Healing is kind of trending right now. There's a lot about self-help and a lot more about mental health, and we're pushing through that stigma, which I think is so amazing. I'm so grateful that the stigma, I think, is loosening at least somewhat. But healing and mental health and wellness is kind of trending right now. And the negative side of that is that there are so many different schools of thought and opinions about how to do it right. And I think that can be very discouraging for a lot of us, and it can actually slow down that process, because when we get into comparison, then we just invite more and more shame. And inviting shame into a space where we really ought to be willing to go to our most vulnerable and hidden places is going to be pretty counterproductive. So I really want to talk about it from that perspective to help us just lean into the fact that there's not really a right or wrong way to grow, and that God is doing something specific in you. He's doing something specific in everyone, and we really have to allow space for him to do that. So we have to be willing to look at some of our own things that come up when we embark on these healing journeys and on this journey of spiritual growth. Some of our own patterns come up, and that actually makes it hard for us to get to where we want to be. So in therapy, we have these things called treatment plans. And anytime a new person starts therapy, they get their own treatment plan. Now, when we learn about treatment plans and about creating them with our clients, one of the most important things to keep in mind is that treatment plans are individualized, which means that they need to be catered specifically to this person. That's important to remember, because while we might deal with similar things, lots of us deal with depression, lots of us deal with anxiety, and there are some general approaches that might be helpful for that, but the way that we implement those things is going to vary based on the person. Now, this concept, I think, can really be applied in a lot of the different areas that we're talking about today. When you think about your own journey of personal growth and healing and self-exploration, there might be some things that are generally helpful, but the way that they impact you on your walk is going to be different than they might impact me on mine. And the same thing when we talk about our spiritual growth and really growing in that spiritual maturity. We live in a culture of comparison. And we really can't avoid it. We can't avoid it. We live in a culture of comparison. This is the age of social media. This is the age of hustle culture. This economy is horrible. And we're just always looking for bigger and better and next. And we're always comparing and trying to keep up with the next person. And I think that also breeds a bit of competition. And we just have this scarcity mindset and feel like there's not enough of anything to go around to anyone. So we're comparing and we're competing, and it just really invites a lot of tension into our lives in general. And it finds a way of sneaking into even our vulnerable and softer spaces where there really is no room for comparison and competition because it's counterproductive and could actually be pretty harmful. But we live in this comparison culture, and we exist and do life with other people. And when we do life with other people, we see them going through things. We see people in our lives going through peaks and valleys. We see them grow. We see them fall. We see them get back up. And to a certain extent, I think it's natural to kind of compare how one person deals with loss to how another person deals with loss. But when that comparison informs us whether or not we're doing it well or whether or not we're doing it right, then that's when we have an issue, and that's when we need to reevaluate some things. Comparison has a way of creating these unrealistic expectations of ourselves. And not unrealistic because the things that we're shooting for are unattainable, but unrealistic because the things that we're shooting for are the things that existed in someone else's life and in someone else's space. The things that we are witnessing other people deal with and the things that we're witnessing other people overcome are part of their individualized journey of growth and healing and spirituality. That's a part of their story, that person specifically. It's not realistic because their story is not yours. And so if your expectation is that you are going to walk through things in the same way or even in similar ways to someone else that you know, that may not be realistic because your story is just not theirs. You have different characters in your story. You have different contributing factors. You have a different type of environment. You've got a different mindset. You've got a different history. You have a different everything. So it's not realistic to expect that you are going to do something in the same way that someone else does. And that could be anything. That could speak to healing from trauma. That could be unlearning and relearning healthy coping skills and defense mechanisms. That could be walking through certain life transitions. That could be starting a new project or trying to birth a new idea. Anything really. That comparison creates unrealistic and therefore unhealthy expectations of ourselves. It's unhealthy because it invites shame. I think I said it before that expectation is the root of all disappointment, and that applies to ourselves as well. When we expect ourselves to walk through something difficult in a specific way and we want it to look like so-and-so, when it doesn't look like so-and-so, we're going to be disappointed in ourselves, and that's going to turn inward. And then we feel like we're doing it wrong. If so-and-so only took 3 months to grieve the loss of their family member, why am I taking 9 months to grieve the loss of mine? That's not fair to you. And that's not a healthy thing. That disappointment invites a lot of shame and blame and guilt and just a lot of icky stuff that now is something else that you're going to have to work through and that you're going to have to grow through. And so that's how it's unproductive, because it slows down the process. It just adds things to the list of stuff that you're already working on and already working through. And there's already plenty, I'm sure. We don't need to add more to the list. We don't need to make things harder for ourselves. But that's what comparison does in this context. One of my favorite quotes and things to say is that healing is not linear, because it's not. I think that because it's kind of trending and we see the highlights of people, then we have this idea that as soon as you decide to grow, evolve, change, heal, in any way, that as soon as you make that decision, it's only up from here, and that just every step of the process just gets easier and easier, and you get better and better, and you just elevate, and that it's just going to be this upward motion all the way. And that is simply not how it works. Healing is really like a roller coaster. Any type of growth. The term growing pains exists for a reason, because it's not always comfortable and it's definitely not always easy. But the primary reason that it's not linear is because it's not predictable. When we decide to kind of embark on this journey, we don't know exactly what we're going to find. There are so many unknown variables. It's very unpredictable. We don't know what we'll find, what we start, and we don't really know what we'll need. Any kind of therapeutic work, a lot of it has to do with understanding your needs and finding healthier ways to have them met. But a lot of us aren't really aware of what those needs are. So, the first step in any type of growth, change, evolution is awareness. And so when I'm working with people in therapy, we spend a lot of time just uncovering things, unpacking things, and increasing our awareness of who we are, what makes us who we are, what are our needs, maybe where did those needs come from, how are we getting those needs met now, what do we think about the ways that we're getting those needs met now? Is it working? Do we think that there's a healthier way of getting those needs met? Am I hurting myself by trying to get these needs met? And there's just a lot of questions that come up, right? So we go on this journey with an open mind, or with a curiosity about ourselves. That's really the best way, I think, to approach a lot of this personal work that we do. But we just don't know what we're going to find. Let's say that maybe you are trying to make a career pivot or career change, and you're going into a new industry. You've really never made a change like this before. You don't know all of what that change is going to entail, what it's going to invite, what it's going to feel like, what it's going to bring up in you. And if you're looking at someone else who's made a career pivot and it seems like it was very easy for them, then if it's not butterflies and rainbows for you, then you're going to feel like you're doing it wrong. And then you may talk yourself out of making that pivot anyway. So we have to make sure that we take the time to get very familiar with everything that we're bringing to the table. And the thing is that different things are going to reveal themselves over time. It happens all the time. I'm working with someone on one thing, and then a few weeks in, something else pops up, and we're like, wait a minute, where did this come from? This is a part of the picture now. We now have to navigate with this thing as well, but we didn't know that when we first started. Sometimes that feels like a setback. And I really want to challenge us all to think about that not as a setback, but just as another piece of the puzzle. And we ought to be grateful, or I would hope that we could find a way to be grateful when different things about ourselves are revealed. I was talking to my parents the other day, and we were talking about how when God sometimes shows us things and shows us things about ourselves, we were talking about how we respond and react to that. And I was telling them that I have gotten to a place in my spiritual walk and spiritual maturity where I'm really grateful when God shows me things about myself, when he shows me my blind spots or areas of improvement, because now I know what I'm working with. Now I know maybe what I need to work on. Now I know what I need to surrender to him. But if he hadn't shown me that, then I would just continue to exist in my dysfunction. So I'm really grateful when God holds up a mirror and shows me where I'm lacking, shows me my missteps. I'm so grateful for that, because he could just continue to let me struggle in that and continue just to let me be unhealthy in that. So I see it as a blessing when he shows me that. And so when we're in therapy, or not even therapy, here's your therapy plug. It's really helpful, and I think important to do this work in the context of a therapeutic space. I don't think that is the only way that you can facilitate growth, though. Therapy is not very accessible to everyone, and it's not everyone's cup of tea. While I think that it could be helpful for everyone, it may not necessarily be enticing for everyone. And since healing is trending right now, and there are a lot of other resources out there, and so a lot of people actually start the process before they get to therapy. There have been several folks that I've worked with, and they're like, I've already learned this about myself, and I've adopted this new habit, and I've uncovered this trauma. So a lot of the work can take place outside of therapy and outside of the therapy room, and that is great. Sometimes we can do a lot of that work and then get to a place where we get stuck, and then we need someone to help us move through that stuck place to continue the work. And that's where it's really helpful to do the work in therapy. Now, it takes people a lot to sometimes come to that conclusion and make that decision to do that work with someone else, with a third party. I understand that. It's not always the easiest. It can be kind of uncomfortable to sit down and talk to a stranger and tell them your deepest, darkest secrets. But for some people, it's easier because this is a stranger that we're talking about. But I say all that to say that all the things that I'm talking about today are not exclusive to therapy. They absolutely do apply to therapy, but they really are talking about any type of intentional personal growth. So I want to say that because I don't want to exclude folks who are not in therapy or who aren't able to be in therapy, because you're still able to grow and you're still able to learn and evolve and mature even outside of therapy. Even though I'm a bit biased, but I'm always going to be an advocate to talk to somebody. Talk to somebody and have someone help you with some of this, especially if it's things that you've been struggling with for a long time and you just kind of keep finding yourself stuck. Talking with someone and having another perspective can be the thing to help you like just break through that stuck place. So it can be really helpful. All right, that was your therapy plug for today. Part of the reason that I think therapy can be helpful is because with so much information and so many resources, it can be kind of overwhelming and overstimulating. There is such a thing as too much self-help. I've had to tell some of my clients, hey, don't read no more books. Don't read no more books. Don't listen to no more podcasts for like a couple of weeks while we're working on this, because it can be a lot. It can be overwhelming and it can kind of confuse things and confuse the process, because every resource comes from a specific perspective, right? We all have different ways of viewing the world. Even in therapy, there are a lot of different approaches or a lot of different theories and frameworks and ways that you can approach even doing therapy. And when we try to just get knowledge about everything, it can kind of muddy things for us and make it a little bit confusing. So if you are on this healing and growth journey independently, I think that that's great. More power to you. I would say be cautious of overdoing it with some of the material that's out there. Some of that material also, I think, sometimes the way that it's written actually does invite more shame. And anytime shame enters the chat, like we're just at that point, we're working backwards and we're working against ourselves. So for most of us, this is kind of how it works. We we see how our life is now and we see the things that we are not satisfied with, and then we have an idea or a vision of how we would like things to be instead. We have an idea or a vision of the kind of person that we would like to be instead. A more organized version of ourselves, a more responsible version of ourselves, a more healed version of ourselves, a more kind, a more loving version, a more or less whatever version of ourselves, a less angry version, a less petty version, whatever. So we have this vision of who we want to be and of who we think we're supposed to be. And I think generally, I think that's okay. The problem is when we have a specific vision of how we're going to get there. And we assume that we already know how to get there. We know how to get from point A to point B. I'm not sure exactly why we think that. Maybe because we've seen other people do it and we've seen how they do it. And so we presume that's the way that it's going to happen for us, or that's the way that it's supposed to happen. The harm in that is that it makes it difficult to trust God and to trust God's plan, to trust that God does have a plan. Because if anything happens outside of our idea of how we're supposed to get from point A to point B, then we resist it. And that can really slow it down. We become a slave to our expectations, so much so that we don't allow room for God to guide us at all. We look for evidence of our own, merit, or evidence of our own wisdom. And we oftentimes do that without going to God first. We embark on these really big projects and these really big journeys. I feel like I've been saying journey a lot today, so I'm trying to find another word, but that's what it is. we embark on these like conquests, sometimes without inviting God or asking him about it or asking him to guide us or order our steps on this journey. what we'll often do is that we'll get started on our own, and then we find a bump or a hiccup or something, and then we want God to fix it. And we want God to get things back on track. But when we say that, what we're saying is, God, make my plan happen. Like, we're telling God our will and then expecting him to get in line instead of the other way around. And I know that a part of the reason that we do this is because we have issues with control and with not knowing. Now, here's the thing. When we're doing this thing with God, when we're walking with God, and when he's growing us and he's healing us, we don't know what all these steps are going to be. He doesn't give us the blueprint. We might really want him to give us the blueprint, but here's the thing, here's the hard truth, is that he doesn't have to. He doesn't have to give us a blueprint. He doesn't have to tell us step A through Z beforehand, but that's what we want. And some of us who are kind of anxious and who are planners, that's how we approach things in our life outside of this realm. We do plan out step A through Z. And it gives us comfort in knowing what's going to happen because it gives us that sense of predictability and that sense of control. But when we are embarking on this journey where there are so many unknowns, it is impossible to have control because it's impossible to predict what's going to happen. And so this is an area where we really have to lean on our faith and on our trust in God, that he is who he is, and that he is orchestrating whatever growth we're experiencing, that he is orchestrating whatever project we're doing or whatever thing it is that he's birthing through us. We have to trust that he's actually doing it. But when we don't know what the next step is going to be, and then the next, and then the next, and then the next, and then the next, it's really hard for us to let go. And so we hold on even tighter to those expectations that we have come up with based on comparison to other people, instead of asking God for guidance and wisdom and discernment based on his will for our life. We just get so rigid and stuck on trying to bring our own will and our own ideas to fruition, so much so that we sometimes end up blocking the blessing that God is trying to bring to us. Because in order to receive the blessing that he's trying to bring to us, sometimes we have to put some other things down to make room so that we can receive. Sometimes in order to receive that blessing, we have to be open to trying something new. We have to be open to taking a detour that we did not anticipate. We have to be open and we have to be very flexible, I think, in order to be open and receptive and ready and available for the blessings that God is trying to bring into our lives. We cannot predict the ways in which God wants to bless us. That in itself is a blessing. I love surprises, okay? And so every time I get an unexpected blessing from God, it's like a surprise. We can't predict it. So start to just look forward to it. We can't predict what the blessings are going to be. And this is a big one. We can't predict when the blessings are going to happen. Now, one of the things that we struggle with the most is time frames and timing. Our timing is different from God's, and his will always be perfect. There's a lot of conversation happening about waiting. And we're in the waiting and how to wait well and what do we do while we're waiting and how to get through the waiting season easier or quicker. We are impatient and we also live in a culture of instant gratification, but that is simply not how God works. The Israelites were in the wilderness for 40 years. And the journey that they were on, I think it was only supposed to take 11 days. So talk about timing. From a matter of days to a matter of decades. Now, they definitely contributed to expanding that time frame, but I think that is just a good example, one, of how we can block our own blessings. And sometimes we can slow things down by trying to rush them. It's so funny how God works. It's the things that we're trying so hard to do on our own strength and on our own force actually ends up having an opposite effect. When we try to rush things, it slows things down. When we try to predict things, there are even more unknowns. But it is really difficult to surrender your time frame to God. That's one that has been so hard for me. I'm getting better and have gotten better, but that has been a tough one for me, surrendering my time frame to God. I look back in my in my journals and in my video diaries, and it's just so funny the way that I sometimes talk about my future and how specific I've been in laying out time frames and when things are going to happen. Let me tell you, it's never happened that way. It has never happened in the time frame that I said it was going to happen. And I'm learning, but that's been a really tough one for me to let go of. And I think it's because I was viewing my relationship with God as transactional. I had this mindset of, well, God, I'm doing all the things. I'm doing all the things. I'm being obedient. I'm being a quote unquote good Christian. And I'm, following your word. So therefore, I should get the things that I want. Like, why wouldn't I get the things that I want when I want them? I've been doing good. And so that's what happens. You do good so that you can get good things and so that you can get the things that you want. But that is not how God works. That's not how he designed our relationship with him. That's not the kind of relationship that he wants with us. Just a transactional one. And I think usually when we think about like transactional relationships, we think of like, okay, God, I prayed, so give me a new car, or I prayed, so give me the spouse, but beyond that, I think that my view of it was, God, I prayed and studied and did all of this. So therefore I should be able to have more of a say in what's happening in my life. I should have more of a say in how quickly things are moving because I'm working with you. So now you work with me. I think that's kind of how I was viewing it. And God had to humble me multiple times. um, but I remember struggling and really having a hard time knowing like what it was that I was struggling with. Um, and when it finally came to me that it was time. It was time that I was struggling with. Um, and that was what I needed to surrender. That's been one of the more difficult things for me to surrender. I think that we just think so much about like how much time we don't have and how much time we've wasted and how much time we have left. And we always think about it from a deficit. And especially when there are things that other people are doing and having and milestones that we're told and conditioned that we should be meeting by a certain time, if those aren't happening, then that's just something else for us to internalize and feel like we're doing wrong, or to internalize and feel like something is wrong with us because this thing isn't happening, or it's not happening quickly, or it's not happening yet, or it's happening too quickly, or whatever it is. But it's just something else for us to internalize and feel ashamed about. So surrendering that time frame, I know, is a tough one for a lot of us, but I think that's where a lot of us tend to get stuck. We tend to get stuck because it hasn't happened yet, and we want to find a way to get there quicker. We want to find a way to get there easier. And when we can find a way of releasing that time frame and just accepting the fact that God is in control and that what's happening in my life is what's supposed to be happening in my life, it makes it easier to settle into the fact that God is doing something in you and through you that he's not doing in or through anyone else. And what I think about now is what an honor. What an honor that there is a work that only I can do, that only I'm called to do. Nobody else can do what God is calling me to do. He might be calling other folks to do something similar, but he's not calling anyone else to be who he's calling me to be or what it is that he's calling me to do. I think that's an honor and a blessing. And I want to be available for that, whatever that is. And as he's slowly revealing things to me and they start to make sense, and there are still some question marks that I have, but it's like he gives you little pieces of the puzzle along the way. As long as we stay like steadfast and connected with him, he gives us pieces of the puzzle when we can handle the pieces of the puzzle. We've talked about having individual and unique relationship with God. And it's because like we all have a different puzzle that we're working on. And having a like close, intimate, personal relationship with God, I think it just reinforces the fact that whatever it is that I'm walking through, I am walking through it like with God alone. Even if my family and I are going through the same thing. There was a season where my family went through just like multiple losses and multiple illnesses all in a short time frame. My family, we were all walking through that, but we all were also walking through our own individual things, which means that the things that we were going through as a family were affecting us all differently. So while we were walking through it together, we were also walking through it alone. Or maybe that was my experience at least, right? Because there were things in me or there were things in my life that were not in theirs. And whether that's external or even internal. I had a moment with God the other day. It was really beautiful. I was struggling with some things. And I was feeling burnt out and just like really stressed. And then I got on a flight and I had a window seat and I was looking out the window and it was just the most beautiful view. And it just really was a reminder to me of God's omnipresence, even when I'm feeling whatever it is, when I'm feeling overwhelmed or stressed or burnt out. And it was just what I needed in that moment to really re-energize and rejuvenate me. And it just put me in such a better mental space. Now, the thing is that none of my circumstances changed. Not one thing in my circumstances changed, but God changed me in my circumstances. And that is the biggest blessing, because my circumstances could change and my heart could stay the same. And then what? You get the bigger car, you get the promotion, you get the house, but your heart is still the same and it's still cold and it's still empty. Then what? Then you're going to be looking for the next thing, the next thing, the next thing. But when God can change you in your circumstances, it just makes me feel so strong and it just makes me feel so victorious over anything, over anything. I got a little off track. I forgot exactly what I was saying, but I wanted to share that too, just because the transformative nature of God and the transformative work that He does that contributes to our spiritual growth cannot be seen or really experienced by other people. I think the people in your life can like indirectly experience it because of how you interact with them based on the transformative work that God is doing in you. But the work itself, it's isolated, which can make it feel isolating. So a lot of us, I think, have these stories of feeling very isolated when we are growing or when we are maturing, or we have these stories of how we got to a certain place mentally, spiritually, emotionally. And that story, more often than not, involves some sort of isolation. And I think that's a part of why the work can feel isolating, because nobody can do it with you. Even in therapy, nobody can do that work with you, which is a part of why it's comforting to have a therapist, to have somebody who is at least like aware of the really tough inner work that you're doing. Sometimes we need that validation to say like, you are actually working really, really hard and it's paying off. Sometimes we need someone else to say, hey, I'm seeing you grow in these ways. Okay, so going back to the treatment plans, when we write these treatment plans and we think about like the goals that we have for therapy and the things that we want to see happen, there's different types of progress that we have to look for. And this is so important. This is so important. There are different types of progress that we have to look for. So generally how it works, somebody comes to therapy and you have these things that you're experiencing, these symptoms, these behaviors that you're going through. And there are 3 components that we look at and that we look at over time to let us know if we're getting closer or further away from our goal. Those things are frequency, duration, and intensity. How often are you experiencing this thing? How long does it last when you do experience this thing? And how intense is it when you experience this thing? We need to know where we're starting on all 3 of these categories: frequency, intensity, and duration. So that when those things change, when any of those things decrease, that's progress and that's growth. So it's not that I'm not better until these things are completely gone. No, not quite. If you were having 4 panic attacks a week and now you're having 1 panic attack a week, that is growth. That is progress. And that is something to be proud of. If your panic attacks used to last for 2 hours and now they last for 20 minutes, that's amazing growth and that is amazing progress. But because we're so hard on ourselves, we don't always see it that way. And we'll say, ugh, I'm still having panic attacks. What's wrong with me? Why am I not there yet? Why am I still dealing with this? Those are some of the chief complaints that I get. Like, I should be over it by now. It shouldn't still be this hard. But when we're like in it, we're so close to it, we don't always see it. And so it's helpful to have someone else say, okay, hold on, but didn't you say that this panic attack only lasted for 20 minutes instead of 3 hours, like when we first started working together? Didn't you say that? Didn't you say that you actually used the tools and coping skills that we've been working on and that you used them and that eventually they helped when before you didn't use anything? Didn't you say that? It's like when you're trying to lose weight and you can't see it because you look at yourself in the mirror every single day and then someone else sees you and they're like, oh, wow, you look at you like I can tell that you've been working on yourself and you've lost some weight and you can't tell because you're looking at it. You're so close to it. That's that phrase, you can't see the forest for the trees. And that happens a lot on our growth journey. And I think, especially when it comes to our spiritual growth and maturity, that the enemy uses that against us and that he uses that to make us feel defeated, to make us feel like there's no point in trying if I'm still struggling with the same thing. But life is cyclical. Everything happens in cycles. Our behavior happens in cycles. Life happens in cycles. We have the same conversations over and over again. We struggle with the same things over and over again. And so the fact that the same cycle keeps happening, that does not mean that you're not actually growing. But look at how you're moving through the cycle instead of focusing on the fact that the cycle is still happening. Yes, maybe we'll get to a point one day where we have a different cycle instead of the one that we're dealing with. But even if this cycle is still showing up, look at how you're moving through it. Look at how you're changing in the circumstance instead of just focusing on the fact that the circumstance has not changed. If you have a cycle of unhealthy communication, look at how you're showing up in that cycle. Look at the way that you are speaking to people. Look at the way that you're able to regulate yourself during conversations. Look at the way that you're able to enforce your boundaries or leave a conversation if need be, right? Even if some of the unhealthy communication is still happening around you. If you have a cycle or a pattern of anxiety and procrastination, if you're still getting anxious and still procrastinating, look at how you are navigating that. How are you interacting with that procrastination? Are you getting over that hump quicker? Are you able to ground yourself when you're feeling anxious and come back to the present when you weren't able to do that before? So pay attention to how you're moving through the cycle instead of just looking at the fact that the cycle is still happening. In order to make any large progress, we have to make so many small steps first. So many small steps first. It's a marathon, not a sprint, honestly. Truly. Baby steps are still steps. And when we are waiting for the ultimate goal before we can celebrate or feel proud of ourselves or feel accomplished, then we miss so much along the way and we feel defeated. And I think we give up a lot. We give up a lot, and I'll hear people say, oh, I tried that before, it didn't work. Did we actually see it through? Or did we get discouraged when a similar challenge presented itself and we went back to some of our unhealthy patterns, some of our unhealthy habits? That is going to happen. Think about this. How long did it take this unhealthy thing to develop in you? Was it years? Has it been with you for decades? Then why do we think that after 2 or 3 weeks of working on it, that we'll be able to undo decades of hurt, of trauma, of dysfunction? It doesn't work that way. And you just don't know what you don't know. And a lot of us are not even aware of those cycles at first. So that's a big part of that awareness that we talked about earlier is, what is the cycle? What is the cycle? Why haven't I been able to see it? And so that level of that awareness part is so important. But the enemy will try to make us believe that the fact that the cycle is still happening means that we're not doing it right and that we are failing and that we might as well give up. The enemy wants to keep us in our dysfunction. He wants to keep us immature. He doesn't want us to grow and evolve and mature at all. So we also have to see the spiritual implications and the warfare that is taking place here as well. If we can accept the fact that there is some growth that has to happen within you first, sometimes before we can see the external impact, I think that's going to help a lot of us. Meaning the work that's happening in you internally before your circumstances change is, I think, maybe more important than the circumstances themselves changing. I think about it like this. While you are working on you, God is working in you. So there are multiple things happening at once, right? You might be working on some of your behaviors. You might be working on some of your thought patterns and processes, and God is doing a work in you while you're doing that. But that work that you're doing is allowing you the room for God to come in and do some of that transformative work. So not only are you learning like new thought processes and healthier ways of coping, but you also are growing closer with God, and you also are being redeemed and learning to see yourself as He sees you and learning to walk in that newness. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about like self-acceptance and spiritual authenticity and intimacy. And this is really the how, the practicality of how that works, right? While we're working on the things that we're aware of, because that's how it all starts, right? It all starts with the things that you're already aware of. I have something that I'm not satisfied with. And so we start with that level of awareness. And as we keep going, we're aware of more and more things. And so then we work on the things that we're aware of. And as they become revealed, then that gets added to the list of things that we're working on. We have to know that there are still so many things that we're unaware of. There are still so many things within us that are unseen and that maybe God is working on, or that maybe we needed to work on these seen things in order to get to a place where God, where God can do that internal and unseen work, or where we need to get to a place where we can regulate our emotions enough to be able to show love to the really annoying coworker that we're going to be assigned to work with later, right? Like we don't know the blueprint, but we have to believe that there is one, and that my blueprint is mine alone. It's different from anybody else's. It's one of one. I was studying the story of Jacob when he was wrestling, and the Bible says that a man came and wrestled with him, and it was like an angel of the Lord, and so we refer to it as when Jacob was wrestling with God, and I was studying that story like really for the first time. Of course, I had heard it a lot, but I was studying it and just really trying to understand like what is the like significance here in this. And I was looking at what was Jacob like before and what was he like after, because that's when his name got changed from Jacob to Israel, when he was wrestling with God. And I was looking at what was he like before and then what was he like after. Now, before, Jacob was pretty self-centered and like kind of arrogant, kind of sneaky. And afterwards, he was less of that and he was more humble. And I was looking at the contrast between who he was before and who he was after he wrestled with God. In that story, he said to the angel of the Lord, I won't let go of you until you bless me. And the part that really stood out is that Jacob received his blessing because he would not let go of God. And that blessing came on the tail end of wrestling for a long time. It came on the tail end of receiving an injury during that wrestle. It came on the tail end of all that. And I think that happens with us a lot of the times. Our blessing comes on the tail end of us having to wrestle with God over something. Maybe it's over things that we don't want to let go of. Maybe it's over things that we're not aware that we need to let go of. But after we get through that tumultuous season with God, we're not the same and we're changed after. And that's not a part of the process that we really anticipate. And so I guess the question for all of us is, what is it that God is trying to wrestle out of our hands so that we can hold on to Him instead? What is it that we are relying so heavily on? What is it that we're allowing to define us that's making it so that we're not holding on to God instead? Is it our ego? Is it our pride? Is it our intelligence? Is it our money? What is it? And could that thing maybe be blocking your blessing? What would it look like if instead you surrendered all of that to God? And I think that wrestling is going to look different for all of us. And so I have been thinking about like, what is it that I'm wrestling with God over? And really, I don't want to have, I don't want it to be a fight. I don't want to fight to have to hold on to anything. I don't want to fight against God or against anything that He's doing in my life. But I want to hold on to Him so that He can get me through whatever challenging, tumultuous time that's going to open me up to this newer version of myself that looks more like Him. So I guess that I'm asking God to reveal some more of the unseen things in me so that I can give them over to Him. But even in that ask, I have to know that He may not answer right away. Even in that ask, even though I'm genuine in that ask, I have to know that I still have no control over that timeline and over that time frame. When we want our circumstances to change so that we can feel better, that's a more surface level approach to things. And sometimes that is what's going to make us feel better, right? We can be in some situations that are like really, really painful and really, really hard. And so sometimes that's what we need. But more often than not, I find that what we need is beyond the surface level. What we need is beyond the surface level. And I think that doing that work that goes beyond the surface level and that goes a little bit deeper is a lot harder. But that is where God really shows up. And that's where we can really start to understand the capacity of who He can be to us if we will allow it. God is going to get to the root. God's going to get to the root, and everything grows from the root. When we talk about trees growing, right, they say it in church that like trees grow up and down at the same time, right? Like there's the seen things, the things that are happening above ground, the growth that's taking place, and it's the growth that's taking place underground, the root system that's spreading far beyond. And that is the growth that we don't see and that other people don't see. And every tree's roots are different. I think it's like a snowflake. I don't think that there are roots that are going to be exactly the same. And so while they need similar things, they might need a different amount of this or a different amount of that. And so we need to embrace the fact that what God is doing in us, He's not doing in anyone else. And that's a beautiful thing. And it's a blessing that He would choose to do anything through us because He don't have to. He did not have to. Okay, let's move on to our scripture for the day, and let's see what the Word has to say about some of this. Today's scripture is coming from Psalms 139, verse 23 through 24. It says, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my anxious thoughts, and see if there be any harmful way in me, and lead me in the everlasting way." There are parts of us that we are not familiar with. There are parts of us that we are not aware of. There are parts of us that only God can reach. And unless we are open to the fact that God can and wants to and will reach those parts and those places in our heart, unless we're open to that, we are limiting ourselves. We're limiting our growth. We are limiting our maturity. We're limiting the amount of access we're giving God to us, which maybe also means that we're limiting the amount of access that we're having to Him. So as we are embarking on whatever kind of healing or growth journey that you're on, doing it with God is always going to be so much better. I think that the growth is going to be like twofold, threefold, because it's happening in multiple realms. It's happening in the physical and it's happening in the spiritual. And so we also need God to reveal the parts of us that need cleansing, the parts of us that are still prone to sin, maybe the parts of us that are a little bit dark and a little bit cold. So we need Him to do that work in us. I just am really in a space of acknowledging that we can't do anything without God. We can't do anything without God, including staying close to Him, including letting go of the past and letting go of hurt, including learning anything new, like nothing. And so when it comes to our own growth and the cleansing that we need, sometimes we cannot do it without God. So if you are struggling, or if you're feeling stuck, or if you feel like you've made a certain amount of progress and now you're stuck and not moving any further, my encouragement to you would be to ask God to help you, invite Him into those spaces that you are aware of and that you are unaware of. Like the scripture says, search me and know my heart. Try me and know my anxious thoughts, if there be any hurtful way in me. Which means I don't know if there's any hurtful way in me. There may be any hurtful way in me. If there is, God, I want you to go. I want you to get in there. And I want you to see what's going on in there so that you can lead me in the everlasting way. Lead me in the way that is of you and that is pleasing to you. But I don't even know of all the hurtful ways that are in me. But God does. So my encouragement, if you're feeling stuck or feeling discouraged at all, is to invite God to search your heart and ask Him to reveal the parts in you that we need to surrender to Him so that we can continue to walk in the steps that He's ordered for us instead of trying to walk in our own. All right, that is going to bring us to our question for the day. Just as a reminder, if you have a question that you want answered on this show, you can send me an email at therapyandprayer@gmail.com, or you can leave a comment wherever you are listening or watching this, or anywhere on social media at Therapy and Prayer. Okay, so today's question says, how can I feel content in my Christian walk and strive to do more without feeling guilty that I'm not doing enough? I thought that this question was perfect because we were talking about comparison and the individualized nature of every person's walk. And the part of that question that talks about feeling guilty about not doing enough, I think that's a direct result of the comparison that we all deal with. Because who gets to determine what is enough or not? That is only determined by other people. And so I think what we first need to do is reorient who is creating the standards for what our Christian walk ought to be like. If the standard is being set by people, then I think we're in dangerous territory. But what is God's standard of what it means to be enough or to be doing enough? We cannot earn salvation. There are not a certain number of check boxes that you have in order to make it. There's not a certain number of good deeds in order to make it. There's not a certain number of ministries that you have to be a part of. There is no tangible standard, really. And I know that that is a bit counterintuitive for a lot of us, and especially those of us who maybe grew up in church, and that was not always the message that we got. And that's not to say that we should not be putting effort into our Christian walk, but that is to say that it's not quantifiable. So this whole concept of doing enough, immediately we're off track with that. So I think, first of all, we have to get rid of that. We have to get rid of this idea that we are or are not doing enough, because I don't think that there should ever get to a point in our Christian walk where we feel like we don't have to do anything else, or like we don't need to do anything more, that we don't need to be putting in effort anymore. And so if there is such thing as enough, then that means that there's a ceiling, and that means that there's a point that we would get to where we would say, okay, cool, I've done all I need to do and I'm not doing any more. And I don't think that that's pleasing to God either. And so The way to be content, the way to be content is to be very honest with whether or not you are continuing to strive towards being righteous. Are we striving towards righteousness? Are we striving towards being like Christ? I think it really comes down to the heart and to the effort. That effort is going to look different day to day. Sometimes that effort looks like just not cussing somebody out. Sometimes that effort looks like going and being a part of a ministry event. Sometimes that effort looks like going to church. Sometimes that effort looks like reading your Bible or looks like praying. Sometimes that effort looks like not saying the thing that you want to say. Sometimes that effort looks like loving the person who is difficult to love. Are you continuing to strive? Are you still putting effort into looking like Christ and into being righteous and living righteously? If you can honestly say yes, then I think that is how you can be content. I think sometimes what happens is that we ration off how much we want to give to God. We ration off the ways that we're willing to invest, I think. And God wants like the best of us, right? So, are you giving God your best? That's what it comes down to. If the answer is yes, then I think that's how we find contentment. Are you giving God your best today? I think we need to simplify it maybe. It's not a number of acts or a number of good deeds or a number of works, but it's, are you giving God your best? Are you loving his people? Are you allowing him to guide you? Are you being open and responsive to the Holy Spirit and to the guidance that the Holy Spirit is giving? Or are you ignoring your convictions and suppressing them because you don't feel like giving something up or because you don't feel like going outside of your comfort zone, right? And that is an assessment that really only you can do. But I really hope that we can let go of the comparison and of this quantitative approach to Christianity. There's not a certain number of things. So this whole concept of enough, I think, is dangerous and kind of damaging. Are you giving God your best today? And it's on a day-to-day basis. It has to be. That's how life works. Are you giving God your best today? Allowing his spirit to take residence in you today. I think that if we can just kind of ask ourselves those questions and really kind of take some time to answer them meaningfully, that will strengthen us spiritually, and it will help us to feel more content in our walk and in the way that we are walking. Contentment is not the same as complacency. And I know that when we hear that word content, a lot of us feel like, no, we can't get content because then I'm going to settle and I'm not going to want to do anything else. We confuse that with complacency. I have an episode on contentment versus complacency. So go back and listen to that. The Bible tells us that we should be content because we have God and because his grace is sufficient. And so it's not that we are striving for more for us, but that we are always striving for the kingdom. So finding contentment in the way that you're walking, I think, is something that we ought to be striving for. But when we fall victim to that comparison, then it makes it hard for us to really enjoy walking with God, and it makes it feel like a chore. And we want to enjoy it. We want to enjoy it because our relationship with him is the most beautiful thing. At least to me it is. Anyway, I hope that was helpful. Thank y'all for being here today. I wasn't exactly sure like where this episode was going to go. I don't know what the title was going to be. I'm still not exactly sure if we captured like one theme or not. But anyway, my encouragement to you all is to embrace the individual nature of your walk and see it as a blessing and as an honor, not as something to be compared to someone else. God is doing a work in you. He's doing a new thing in you, and he's doing a new thing in somebody else. So let him work. He's able to work in multiple people at once. Let him do his part and you do yours. That's it. All right. That's all I have for you all today. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for listening as always. I love you so much, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks for listening to this episode of Therapy and Prayer. Make sure you're subscribed and following wherever you listen to podcasts, and if the spirit moves you, go ahead and leave us a review. If you want to submit a question to be answered on this show, send us an email at therapyandprayer@gmail.com, and make sure you're following us on TikTok at Therapy and Prayer. Thanks again for listening. I'll talk to you soon.